the counterfactual is the whole character of the war would have been changed had the Trent Affair actually led to belligerency.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if there would have been an Emancipation Proclamation in this alternative timeline.
Do we risk Canada to get a good relationship with a new state called the Confederate States of America?
I don't know what you think, Chris. I think in this scenario, I think Napoleon III would have been right, let's go.
Send the troops to Mexico.
This is becoming, whatever the intentions of the Lincoln administration may have been, this is becoming a war in which the fate of slavery is in the balance. That is when things start to shift.
The critical thing for Britain, and to a lesser extent France, is we want to back a winner here. What if the Confederate state actually wins?
This is not a United States. Do we see kind of America emerge as this global power?
No. No, we don't.
Do we ever then see the US come back together? As one.
This
is where we have to...
Lincoln's second term.
On the battlefield, the American Civil War was just that. A bloody and drawn-out conflict, but one confined to the US borders. Yet across the Atlantic, the interests of Europe's great powers were still at play. Both Britain and France officially remained neutral, but were heavily involved with trade and underhand diplomacy. As the world's first superpower, Britain had a complicated relationship with the Union, while also importing cotton from the south for its textile mills. So when what became known as the Trent Affair in 1861 saw a British vessel boarded and 2 Confederate diplomats captured, there was no guarantee this would not lead to escalation. Of course, Britain did not join the fight, but today we imagine a timeline where the Union could have met the Empire. I'm Fergus Macphee, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every episode, we focus on a different military campaign or a tide of history, and with the help of our experts, we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today, it's the decision by Britain and others not to intervene in the American Civil War. Yet if they had, where might the United States and the world be today? These are, of course, questions for our experts. And joining me today, as ever, the historian and author Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry. And for the first time on the channel, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Adam Smith, Edward Osborne Professor of US Politics and Political History, and the Director of the Rothermere American Institute at the University of Oxford. Welcome to you both. Now, we've got a map in front of us of America in 1861. Of course, we see the Union States up here, see the Confederate States down here. There's a line here showing at different times that they seceded. Chris, we're going to be talking a lot about 1861, 1862 in this episode. What's kind of the character of the conflict that we see and the American Civil War during this period?
I think everybody's familiar with how the American Civil War started. It's really precipitated by the election of Abraham Lincoln and an agenda, essentially, which is at odds with both the political and the economic aspirations of a lot of these states in the South. There's a progressive secession away from the Union. And of course, the Confederacy is looking to set itself up as a legitimate power in opposition to the remainder of the Union. And now President Lincoln says, no, that's not right. This is an insurrection. We don't recognize you as a national opponent. And the position taken by Britain and France in relation to this is we recognize these states as a belligerent. We're going to stay neutral, but we don't see you in equal parity with the Union. And the whole debate over the next 18 months, 2 years, is whether it's in Britain or France's interest to recognise the Confederacy, or there's a greater threat from the Union in terms of their interests as to whether they go along with what the Confederacy wants. And that is recognition, its investment, and also, of course, the ability to break any blockade or indeed military manoeuvres that the Union wants to impose on the South.
Recognising as a belligerent, I mean, in practice, does that sort of mean that we recognise you have concerns and we recognise like your place in this war? I mean, what does that actually mean?
In the law of the time, it meant that we recognise that you are basically in conflict with another entity. It may or may not be a country, but in relation to that, we are not going to interfere with your operations. So you're not like a pirate on the high seas or anything like that. You have belligerence rights, which means you can trade. We won't interfere with that. We also might actually protect you if you are assailed in certain parts of the country, of the world in which we have an interest. Yes. That's always assumed, it's never ever stated. But the fact of life is that Britain and France say we are going to be absolutely neutral. So if we're taking our vessels to ports in the Confederate States, we don't expect them to be interfered with. That's the point. Yeah. And as a belligerent, obviously you have to respect our rights on the high seas and in relation to trade and things like that.
Adam, welcome to History Undone. Thank you so much for joining us. If we pick up from there then, we've talked about they recognise them as belligerents. What is actually the relationship between Britain and France and the Confederacy and also the Union at this point?
Well, Britain, I mean, should we take them separately? And there's a different story in each case to a degree. I mean, Britain has obviously a long and complicated history with the United States as a whole, needless to say. And actually relations between Britain and the United States in the immediate run-up to the Civil War have been about as good as they've ever been. When there've been border disputes in North America, they've been settled amicably. There are strong British relationships of all kinds, of a trading kind, of a personal kind, relationships based on immigration and family, as well as trade and investment in both the North and the South. But this is a complicated situation, right? Because there are people in Britain, of course, when the American Civil War breaks out, who are delighted. And there's a schadenfreude, right? I mean, the sense that this upstart young democracy has collapsed just as we always said it, as we always imagined it would.
Palmerston always refers to it as the disunited states. Of course. He calls it Yankee land.
Yes.
And, you've got a situation where Palmerston's sort of dislike of democratic systems is only outweighed by his distaste for slavery. Yeah. And even that is competitive at some stages of this. Sorry, Adam.
Yeah, and I mean, there's no proper government in the United. I mean, viewed from London, viewed from Britain in 1860, 1861, there's no proper federal government, there's no proper army. I mean, there's a few troops stationed in the West. There's a very small navy. I mean, this looks like a bit of a mess of a country, and it's hard to think. Viewed from Britain, there is a view that it's hard to see how, if this newly established Confederacy is determined to achieve its independence, it's difficult to see how the United States can possibly have the military power to subdue an area which, as you can see, is the size of Western Europe. If even Napoleon couldn't conquer an area that size, how on earth can Abraham Lincoln and a few thousand troops do so? So there's a lot of kind of disdain, I suppose, is what I'm saying, in some quarters in Britain.
You said they kind of thought it was a mess. Is it the case? Something we see today from governments, our own government. Are they sort of saying this is not our war?
Well, it might be our war if we don't play this right. I mean, that's the key point. One of the key issues for the British government is Canada. Now, there's always been a bit of tension along this border all through the sort of early 19th century. And in fact, during the Civil War itself, you see raids across the border in both directions. Quite extraordinary. But the critical thing for Britain, and to a lesser extent France, is we want to back a winner here. What if the Confederate state actually wins? We're going to have a relationship. It's rather like the situation in any country that has an insurrection. We want to actually have a relationship with what comes afterwards. So all of this is balanced on a knife edge. And what you've got is a situation where the Union is saying, look, if you come in on the side of the Confederacy or even show any sort of favour towards them in terms of trade or loans and things like that, we're going to invade Canada. And we've done it before. We did it in the 1812 war. So don't think we can't do it. We're going to put privateers out against your trade. That's the other thing. And we might take an interest in the West Indies as well while you're at it. So that sense that we might go to war with you immediately is put out there by the Union. And meanwhile, the Confederacy is pushing out diplomats to say, look, we need recognition. To be fair, the initial diplomats they push out are not really the sort of people you and I would call diplomats. They're fairly hard driving types. And they actually get into the capitals of Europe and they're rejected on their personalities rather than their policies. So not a great start by the Confederacy. But the key thing is, and Adam's hinted to this already, the Confederacy think we've got a monopoly of cotton here that goes into Britain and France, and we're going to break them if that is cut off.
King cotton diplomacy. Right? That's the phrase.
That is the phrase. I knew we'd get there at some point.
It's like having oil and gas, in modern times. Conversely, Britain and France get a lot of food imports from, and we've just had 2 very bad harvests in Europe just before this. So you've got real stranglehold on these key sort of materials that are going across the Atlantic, or they're not. It's as simple as that. Now, to be fair, Britain says, actually, we've got a year's supply of cotton, so we can defer this decision. We can also go to Egypt, and we can go to Turkey.
Yep.
So they're thinking...
And eventually India.
Of course.
Yeah, and India.
It takes time, of course, to build up those alternative supplies of raw cotton. But
does France need the cotton more than Britain?
As much, because you look at Alsace and Normandy, they've got textile mills as well that are driving this. They're in a worse place than Britain is in some ways, although they're looking for other ways of getting cotton. In fact, the Brits say we might sell you some.
Yeah, I mean, the French economy is in total less dependent on the import of raw cotton than the British economy is, but France has fewer options, less of a stockpile, and fewer options to supply from other areas. But on the very eve of the American Civil War, more than 90% of the raw cotton coming into Britain is coming from the southern states of the United States. So as Chris rightly says, this cotton is in the mid-19th century what oil is in the 20th and to some degree the 21st century.
So we're going to move on very, very quickly into how this possibly could have come about. It's worth saying just now, there's a Union blockade, right?
Yeah.
But interestingly, if you look at the international law that comes in 1856, it's only legal if you can enforce it. Yeah. And the Confederacy make a great play on this and say, look, we're going to actually get some blockade runners. We'd like you to take part as well. And Britain says quite clearly, we will trade with the southern ports if we want to in neutral ships. And that continues. And to give you some idea of the scale, there were over 1,300 British blockade runners, of which 1,000 got through during the whole war. So essentially, it's only legal if you can enforce it. And that's why you see a huge build-up of the Union Navy through the Civil War to keep this blockade
There's
going.
a famous meeting between the British ambassador, Lord Lyons, and the Secretary of State, William Seward, who have a very interesting, complex relationship. Yeah. But right at the beginning of the war, Seward says, right, we've established this blockade. And Lyons says, this looks like a paper blockade. It's a paper blockade. And the question of what the status, as Chris rightly says, the status legally and practically of this blockade remains an issue in the coming years.
Yeah.
Well, that is some of the background. Let's focus on the events themselves, which could have seen Britain enter the war. Okay, we've got a new map in front of us now showing a slightly wider area. We've got obviously the whole of North America essentially. Mexico down here, which will be very important in a second. We've got the Caribbean, of course, over here. Adam, I want to come to you. We finished the last section obviously talking about Britain. I did say we talk about France as well. What are the French interests at this point? Well,
France also has this trading relationship, this requirement for cotton. They have a ruler, an autocratic ruler, Napoleon III, who is deeply sympathetic with the Confederacy. Later on in the story of the American Civil War, France are going to get to the stage where they intervene in a civil war situation in Mexico and try to install a French supporting monarch. So there are French troops on the ground here in Mexico by 1863. So France is very involved with troops in North America. And so there's a kind of this constant sense that if there is a natural sort of ideological alliance potentially forming between France and the Confederacy.
And France tried to get the British on side in terms of mediation, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And the French and the British navies, who we often think of, France is Britain's constant enemy during this period, but actually the French and British navies are cooperating in interesting ways in the Atlantic. I mean, they both have squadrons that are operating throughout this whole area. They know what each other are doing, and sending signals to one another, and are monitoring the effectiveness of the blockade in a quite a coordinated way, looking for signs of weakness.
And there's another interesting issue, of course. In 1859, the French build the first world ironclad called La Gloire, which is then followed by the British Warrior. Now, at this point, the Americans don't have anything to match these ships in terms of speed or in terms of firepower. So very powerful presence off the coast here in the West Indies. And as Adam says, it sets the scene really for the French to intervene here in Mexico, where they're developing commercial interests. They've got investment there. They're seeing the Civil War going on, crisis of legitimacy. And the Confederacy say, look, we get your interests in Mexico.
Yeah.
If you support us, then we're going to help you. They don't mean it. If you look at the correspondence, they say we have an interest in Mexico if we become a functioning state that can actually develop in that area. And of course, later on, the development down in that area, as far as the whole of the United States is concerned, is quite significant. So it's used as leverage in the same way that Canada is used as leverage by the Union.
Throughout the war, one of the ways in which the Confederacy continues to supply cotton to Europe and receive hard currency in return is through the Mexican port of Matamoros, which is just right there on the Texas-Mexican border. So that nexus of that far west of the Confederacy and Mexico and the French is just it's really interesting what's going on.
And that's their leverage, right? Even though you say they don't mean it, that's the leverage they've got.
But Fergus, you're absolutely right when you say that there's quite a considerable lobby in France saying we need to get involved, but we're not doing it without the Brits.
Yeah.
I mean, they actually loaned the Confederacy $15 million at one stage. So you're seeing that there is this constant urge to get involved. They're distracted, of course, because they're looking at something else, and that's called the rise of Prussia. Prussia is knocking at the door. You're just about to have the second Danish-German Confederation War. So they're quite concerned with what's going on behind them at this stage. They don't want a two-front situation, if you like. Although, as they say at the time, the Navy will handle this, the Army will handle this aspect. But they're worried about that, just as Britain is worried about what's going on in the Ottoman Empire at the time and in Denmark. So there are distractions off stage going on here.
And just to underline what Chris is saying there, that while we're here to talk about the possibility of European intervention and the way this story is told from an American perspective, there's a sort of assumption that the world is agog at what's going on in North America, which to some degree has some truth to it because there's a high degree of fascination with this. But bluntly, the point is this is never going to be high priority for either Britain or France unless it absolutely has to be. As Chris said, and unless they're sucked into the war because their interests are really at stake, they would much rather keep at it because they've got, frankly, much, much, much more important things to attend to in the rest of the world.
We will get into when they might have been sucked in 1 second. Just on that then, up here, the Union states, are they seriously thinking about Britain and France joining the war? Are they concerned at all?
Oh yes, very, very much so. I think, look, this is a country, the United States, that has been created, and although this is not part of general American mythology, because of the French, right? The French intervention in the Revolutionary War was the decisive factor that enabled Britain to be in the end defeated militarily at Yorktown, even, importantly, French naval power as well as French forces on the ground. So everybody knows, and there's plenty of precedent for this, that the establishment of new nations, that secessionist movements, really only succeed with the help of outside help. So it's on the agenda from the start.
And the irony is actually stated in cabinet. The British cabinet has a discussion about, hang on, didn't they secede from us back in 1776, 83? So why shouldn't they secede from them? That conversation actually takes place, and you've got the two factions in the British cabinet talking about this all the time. And I have to say, it's quite entertaining to tell you the truth. This is high rhetoric going in both directions, and it's great. But that irony is quite marked.
Okay, if we move to 1861 then, and the Trent Affair, we've been teasing it since the start. Just talk us through what and where that happens.
So this is part of, Chris mentioned earlier the Confederacy had an initial effort, a rather undiplomatic effort to send undiplomats to Europe. They make a more serious effort in October of 1861 to send two very experienced politicians, Mason and Slidell, one to London, Mason to London, Slidell to Paris. The question, of course, is how do they get there? They've got this blockade to get through. To cut a slightly long story short, they leave Charleston. They have a stop in Nassau. They end up in Cuba, and from Havana they manage to get onto a British vessel, the Trent. That ship is then pursued by an interesting character, Wilkes, who is the commander of an American vessel called the San Jacinto, I think. Is that right, Chris?
Yeah, but he happens to be in a position to intercept. He has no authority to do it.
No.
The irony is that the United States already have put a ship on the tail of the Trent that is authorised to do something about it. And this is critical later. But the fact that, I think it's called the James Adger, the original one that was authorised to intercept. So if you like, the police guard that's chasing the Trent actually never makes it. And the San Jacinto
and it becomes,
once
again, understandings of international law become really important here. So it
would, as they are today,
and so it would have been acceptable, as generally understood, for an American vessel to board this British ship and take off it diplomatic correspondence. So if that would be a legitimate thing for a belligerent to do, or to take the ship, to take the British ship into port, and a court of admiralty would remove. That's not what happens. What happens is that Wilkes boards this British vessel, reports differ, potentially quite forcibly, removes these American diplomats, these Confederate diplomats, and their families, and takes them to a prison in Boston. And the British ship, the Trent, sails on.
How quickly, when that happens, Lincoln and the Union back here, are they pulling their hair out and backpedaling straight away?
No, because Wilkes is treated like a hero. So there's official receptions and everything. Meanwhile, Britain's saying, hang on, we are the world's maritime hyperpower. You don't do that to us. And there's a real issue here. And in fact, the only reason it doesn't escalate is because of the delay in communications across the Atlantic, because the British immediately say, act of war, we want them released, we want reparations for this.
And it should be said that when the news, and as Chris, there's a 2-week delay at least, because there had in fact been a transatlantic cable that had been laid, but it had been broken. So, this whole story would have been different potentially, and might well have been a worse outcome in terms of British and American war if the cable had been there and there'd been instant communication, but there isn't. There's this 2-week delay all the time. But when the news reaches Britain of this violation of the flag, the assumption made by the British government is that this is intended by the Lincoln administration as an act of war. They assume that this has been done on direct orders. It's clearly a violation of the British flag. And so they feel like they have no choice. They're being put in a position where the Americans have effectively, the Union has effectively made an act of war against them.
And Britain then starts looking north after that.
No, if you look at the cabinet papers of the time, they say, OK, what are the balance of risks and opportunities here? And they say, look, Canada's vulnerable. We really don't want privateers on our trade at this point. We haven't got enough to contain that. And anyway, is it a big deal? And the way they get round it is they say, of course, this chap acted on his own initiative. He didn't do it with the authority of the Americans. And the Americans are very happy to say that's exactly right. and in fact, of course...
They don't say that he was in the wrong, though, do they?
No,
they say he
do.
acted alone, but they say, he might have been right to do it.
The British government, send an ultimatum, which is, famously has been watered down by Prince Albert when he sent the dispatch in the last 2 weeks of his life. They send an ultimatum to the Lincoln administration demanding the return of the Confederate diplomats and an apology. Yeah. Well, they get the first, they don't get the second, and that in the end is the basis for a sort of face-saving compromise. Yeah. But it's a hard issue for the Lincoln administration. They have this sort of key cabinet meeting on Christmas Day, 1861, when in fact it's the Secretary of State, William Seward, who's regarded in Britain as being the principal antagonist of Britain.
Real Anglophobe.
Real Anglophobe. But in fact, it's him, the Secretary of State, who argues that it's impossible to fight two wars at a time, that on this issue, the United States has to find a face-saving.
And also, they might recognise the Confederate States. As a result, the blockade then becomes illegal. That's the point. And of course, the British Navy the Royal Navy would then seek to break it.
So how close does it come, the Trent Affair, to Britain entering the war? How close realistically is it?
Neither side wants it, madam, really.
I don't think, it might be better for this podcast if we could say, they were that close.
We'll get to that, don't you worry.
But really,
not here.
this is why I do think the counterfactual of the cable not being broken is interesting, because if decisions had actually had to be made in split-second time, there was such outrage in Britain and there was such jubilation in the United States at the taking of the Confederates from this British ship, that I think at that moment, if there'd been hair-trigger decisions making, it's easier to see how shots could have been fired and something could have escalated. But in fact, the time delay allowed for tempers to cool, for wise heads to prevail.
The style of the British government at this period under Palmerston would have been to do an exemplary action. So you probably find that the Royal Navy would have gone and taken out an American warship or attacked an American port or something like that, and gone, you got it now?
Yeah.
Do you understand how this works?
The Royal Navy could have, bombarded Boston or something, which is where Mason and Sligo were being held. That would have been perfectly conceivable as an action.
And basically, the British would have said, okay, it's even now. We'll now carry on from there.
Okay, well, obviously, in reality, we know that Britain didn't enter the war, obviously. But does that relationship between Britain and the Union recover, or is it still pretty frosty?
It's still interesting because British Prime Minister Palmerston is thinking, who's going to win this? Throughout 1861, the feeling is the Confederates might actually either win this or force a score draw. So we want to be involved in benefiting from either situation. So as long as it's in the balance, particularly around the time of Second Bull Run, there's particular outrage when the Union sees New Orleans. And the general there starts treating the locals pretty badly. And there's all sorts of issues associated with that. And British public opinion is really quite outraged by that as well. There's another issue. We start to have a cotton famine in Lancashire at this time. And people are saying, we need to break the blockade, actually, to get the
huge
cotton
unemployment and suffering in the cotton districts. And as late as October 1862, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, William Gladstone, gives a speech in Newcastle in which he says Jefferson Davis has made an army, he is making a navy, and he's done more than that, he is making a nation. Now, for Gladstone, the great liberal hero, what is happening in the Confederacy, how is this different, Gladstone would say, to what is happening in Italy?
Sure.
Right? So the movement for Italian unification, which is a great liberal nationalist cause, the support for Hungarian nationalism after the 1848 revolutions, the Greek nationalist movement. Why is this any different? National self-determination is a great liberal principle. And furthermore, the Confederacy are free traders. And so free trade and national self-determination, this seems like a liberal project that we can get behind. There is, of course, one big thing, which is a problem for Gladstone and the liberal supporters of the Confederacy, and that's slavery.
Of course, But there is a moment, isn't there, in 1862, Charles Francis Adams Sr., He's the
minister.
He's the minister for the
Yeah.
US and the UK, and he's sort of saying the Confederacy are doing quite well here. Let's bide our time and see, but mediation might genuinely be a possibility.
Well, you've got to remember, right up until Gettysburg, the Confederacy are saying, look, we can force a decision here. If we win at Gettysburg, in fact, they had a minister, I think, en route to Washington at the time to actually negotiate in case Lee's incursion actually prevailed and Gettysburg was won. So right up until that point, they're thinking, we might actually settle here. But at this stage, they're looking to win. You've got a succession of Confederate victories. Lee is, right up there in their throat. As I said, you've got Second Bull Run, been very successful, very close to Washington, and all this pressure. And as Adam says, within the cabinet, you've got Gladstone and Russell saying, there are great benefits here to actually recognising the Confederacy. We can actually face this out. And all the time, Palmerston saying, well, we've got Canada, we've got our merchant fleet, it's all a bit crazy. And Palmerston plays it really well. And right up to the point, and I think it's worth mentioning that what really swings it is the Union actually being able to sustain the pressure. Battle of Antietam, very, very, very important. And I think critical, Adam, is the Emancipation Proclamation. At that point, the last sort of kick from Gladstone and Russell is we're going to have a slave revolt, we're going to have unrest. We need to intervene for humanitarian reasons, because it's going to be chaos in the South.
Would you say that is, we'll get into the counterfactuals in just a second, that is the kind of the final nail in the coffin for this sort of idea?
I think, as Chris has just implied, not immediately, right? Not immediately. I mean, the Emancipation Proclamation is there's a suspicion in Britain about the Emancipation Proclamation and its motives. But once, let's say by the spring and summer of 1863, it becomes clear that this is becoming, whatever the intentions of the Lincoln administration may have been, this is becoming a war in which the fate of slavery is in the balance. That is when things start to shift. But that is also at the moment when, as Chris has reminded us, in June of 1863, General Lee appears to be once again at his pomp and pushes 90 miles north of Washington, D.C. into a free state, into South Central Pennsylvania. And that is why, classically, Gettysburg is remembered, not incorrectly in my view, as a critical turning point. Because if that battle had gone another way, the political ramifications, including in terms of international relations, as we're discussing, would have been enormous.
And in some ways, you might think that Gettysburg is a deliberate attempt, the campaign is a deliberate attempt to try and get recognition from France and Britain. It's a last kick, basically, to be able to do that. And so in strategic terms, it's brilliant. All it needed was Longstreet to go around the right flank of the Union at Gettysburg, and it probably would have worked.
What Lee always recognised was that the only way, in the end, the Confederacy could win the war was by persuading the North to stop fighting, just as the only way the American rebels could win the war was by persuading the British to abandon North America. How was that to be accomplished? First and foremost through, and really in the end only through Northern public opinion. The intervention of European powers on the side of the Confederacy would have been such a huge blow, I think, to Northern public opinion, that combined with military coming on the back of Confederate military success, it could have broken the back of the Union's will to carry on the war.
I mean, it's interesting that 1864, the Confederate states say actually, perhaps we'll have gradual emancipation. They actually put that as a policy to the European partners because they see how dramatic and how decisive that becomes.
Is this, we're bringing the French back in here, is this as important to France as it is to Britain? I mean, presumably not.
No. You've got to remember that the British in 1807 said, we're abolishing.
Exactly,
And in fact, the Union play it very smart because they say, if you capture any ships that have got slaves on them, even if they're American Union ships, you can actually free the slaves. So they really pick up on this, and it becomes a war about slavery in the end. There's no question about that.
I mean, France has an autocratic government. Right? I mean, that is a fundamental difference in this story. What's happening in Britain, the anti-slavery, the very deeply embedded anti-slavery movement in Britain is hugely consequential here. The press and public opinion in France just aren't as important as they are in the.
If you look at the newspapers in Manchester, and in Lancashire at the time, they say, we don't mind suffering because it's in the interests of slavery.
Yep.
And of course, you're in the middle of a huge non-conformist religious area up in Lancashire. And
Abraham Lincoln has his own relationship with Manchester, of course.
yes, indeed, he does, yeah. And so, you've even got huge sections of the British public saying, we support the Union purely on this issue. There's nothing else going for it. And as I said, during the Great Cotton Famine, you've got the workers saying, yeah, we get it, we're laid off, but frankly, there's a bigger issue here.
Some of them,
yes, that's right. You're right. Yeah, I think there's a Man City United issue here, isn't it?
Well, it is now time to move on because that is the real history behind Britain and France's decision not to enter the American Civil War. Now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. Okay, time to get into what we love doing here on History Undone and ask ourselves some of those really long-term questions. Had the British or the French intervened on the side of the Confederacy? I want to come to you first, Adam, because this is something we've teased in our previous topic here. That cable, if we go back to the Trent Affair, if that doesn't break, are we in a different situation?
I think this is our best bet at a really good counterfactual, right? So as we were discussing before, there was this huge desire to determination to go to war in the north, and the British, when they heard about it, were right. Let's. There was this rage militaire in both countries for a while, and so in our scenario here, the cable is still there. There's instant communication, almost instant communication across the Atlantic, and this public emotion becomes uncontainable.
Yeah.
That's the scenario we're working with.
We won't wait mentality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We talked about France earlier on not coming on side, not being able to get the British on side. The cable breaks, the British join. Do the French say, we're quite keen to get involved?
I think Napoleon III, I don't know what you think, Chris. I think in this scenario, I think Napoleon III would have been, right, let's go.
Send the troops to Mexico. I mean, they go in 1863. And so they put Maximilian I of Austria on the throne there. I think they bring it forward, to tell the truth, because they're already thinking about it. They're already involved there. So there's opportunities. Now, we've got to remember the Palmerstonian doctrine here. We don't have permanent allies. We don't have permanent enemies. We only have permanent interests. So this would have been governed entirely in Britain by what the interests are at that particular point. Now, the critical thing, I think, is the Union's on the back foot right now. So if public emotion had actually sort of carried away the government on this, they'd have gone, OK, can we defend Canada? Yes, we've just sent 11,000 troops there. That's the first thing. They're tied up with the Confederacy right now. We've got our fleet out here with the French. Together, we can probably contain the privateers. And our trade with the West Indies can also be protected. So actually, we could probably take a point. My own view, as I said earlier, is I think there would have been an exemplary punishment for that. And everybody would have stood back and said, where are we going with this? But these things do have a habit of escalating. Now, if you get that situation where Britain and France say, right, we're going for our interests here, then you are going to break the blockade. That's the first thing you're going to do.
With the might of the Royal Navy as well.
And the French Navy as well. You're going to say, we're going to break that blockade. We're going to trade with the Confederate States. We're not going to drop to 90% of our trade going away, which is what happened. You open safe lanes, convoy routes out. Confederacy can sell its cotton. You can send weapons and other things in. And in fact, it has to be said, a huge amount of weapons, saltpeter, powder, all the other constituents did actually go into the Confederacy anyway. So you break the blockade, and the Confederacy is starting to get a lot of war material and loans.
And do you think, Chris, that would have been a relatively easy thing for the Royal Navy to do? I would assume so.
Yeah. I mean, and also you would have released all the ships being built for the Confederate Navy at that point. So the Alabama wouldn't have been an issue. What was it called? The Stonewall was being built at the time. So the Kearsarge incident doesn't occur. And I'm afraid, I think the Royal Navy, after the history from the end of the 18th century, would have been absolutely going for it and saying, we'd like to take them out.
I think so. And I think I mean, I think Canada would have been vulnerable, though. As you say, they're sending troops. 12,000 troops are being sent to Canada to reinforce
it. And they can't fight on two fronts here, can
they? Well, they can. If they actually change the legislation, Fergus, they can. The problem for the Union is they have these time-limited conscripts, which they later extend, and everybody's very upset about it. But they have actually got the manpower.
Yeah, they've got the manpower, and you know, a fight against Canada is something that people in New England have been gunning for ever since the revolution. Yeah. I think you would, in this scenario, I reckon you would have seen a repeat of the attempt that was made in the very beginning of the Revolutionary War. This is sort of this invasion corridor down the Hudson Valley here from New York up into Canada. I think you would have seen an American incursion up to Quebec and Montreal, just as you had in the Revolutionary War. And I think it would have been hard for Britain to defend it. And I think Britain knew that.
Yeah.
I think there would have been serious vulnerability to the territorial integrity of at least parts of Canada.
You agree with that as well?
Yeah, because I think if you, it was discussed in Cabinet at the time, so it's not just us saying it. I mean, what you would have done on these fronts and in the West as well, you'd have held. You'd have basically fixed the Confederacy, stopped them incursion.
So you don't think the Confederacy advances really much from the South in this situation?
The Confederacy wasn't aspiring to do that, didn't have the manpower to do that, wasn't necessary for the Confederacy to do that. You know, the point of Lee's incursion into Pennsylvania was not to occupy Pennsylvania. It was a strategic thing in order to damage northern Wales. So I think in this scenario, the Confederacy obviously would have been delighted that the North was being distracted by Canada, and they would have been perfectly happy to defend the existing borders. There's a question about Missouri, which had been in a state of civil war since the early 1850s.
I mean, the Union at that point, Halleck would have said, let's just hold on to everything here that we've got, let them come to us, and we know that going against fortifications in the American Civil War was always a bad move.
Which would also have been hugely controversial in the North, though, politically, because that's the de facto to recognise the existence of the Confederacy. You know, the Northern military strategy had to involve invading the South.
So the decision in Cabinet is, do we risk Canada to get a good relationship with a new state called the Confederate States of America? And in the end, people said, the risks are too great. They're not being that successful. We don't see them sustaining this war over the long term, even if we support them. And so the decision is made on a balance, and I think probably a correct balance of strategic issues, that we don't get involved.
It would have been... Sorry.
No, please.
No, it would have been... So, I mean, I'm getting really into imagining this.
Yeah, this is exactly what you've got.
I think this would have been... initially, there would have been great enthusiasm in portions of Britain for this new war against the United States. After, let's just imagine, exemplary punishment of kind of some bombardment of the port of Boston and various other things triggering, and the invasion of Canada. But this would have been a pretty hard war after a few months for the British to sustain politically. Not least because over the preceding 20 years, there's millions of pounds of British investment in the Union. Yeah. I mean, so the City of London would have been appalled by this situation, right? So there would have been huge pressure, even after the war had started, for the British to pull back, for some kind of negotiations, for some sort of other sort of resolution about it. So it's really, we need to build counterfactuals on counterfactuals in order to kind of work out how this would have played out.
There's another issue here, Fergus. Yeah. You've got 50,000 Brits.
That's what I was going to ask.
Fighting for the Union at the time.
Yeah. From a pure PR perspective, does that matter? Does that come into it at all?
And the fact of life is, what do you do if you're a Brit? I mean, I was reading a diary on the train coming up today of a guy who said he was with a company in the Massachusetts regiment, and he said, look, all our NCOs, all our sergeants are British. They're all veterans from the Crimea and the Indian Mutiny and things like that. So you've got quite a lot of emotional and practical investment in the Union. So if you're told to invade Canada, what do you do at that point?
Yes.
So that's an interesting, it'll take quite a lot of
But
people.
the Irish
So-
regiments would have been up for it.
The Fenians, yeah, absolutely, yeah. And in fact,
I mean, there were in fact incursions in
That's right.
Canada anyway, from northern Maine.
I mean, it's quite interesting. In 1864, there's an attack on Vermont from Canada. And even after the Civil War, up until 1871, you've got this Fenian Brotherhood that's constantly doing raids across the border. So it's pretty live, this border. It's not as peaceful as it is now.
So, if it does become difficult for Britain politically and also militarily, are we moving towards a negotiated settlement along
That,
sort of
to
this
my
side?
mind, that's what seems to happen in 1863. Britain and France are saying, look, this could go horribly wrong, particularly after the Emancipation Proclamation, because what they're worried about, as I said earlier, is a slave revolt and unrest in the South. I'm not sure whether this is a pretext or not, but Gladstone and Russell are both saying, look, we've got to intervene. This is going to be a huge humanitarian crisis here. And if the Union break through, it's going to be even worse. So what they want to try and do is create the conditions for a peace. And of course, the Union says, well, hang on, we're in charge of this, you're not. It's our business. Like everybody says today, it's the inhabitants' issue. Meanwhile, the Confederacy are still trying to provoke a situation where they can be recognised. Let's not forget, a lot of stuff is coming in.
Yes.
This blockade is like a colander. It's not actually tight. And so that's continuing. And dare I say it, with the shipbuilding that's going on, with all this going on, Britain's doing very well out of the situation already. And so is France. As we said, they're into Mexico. They're getting on with their agenda.
I'm just wondering if there would have been an Emancipation Proclamation in this alternative timeline.
Oh, that's true.
Because I was going to, public opinion in Britain surely would still have pushed for that eventually, or not?
Well, if what we're imagining here is war breaking out between Britain and the United States with the cable in place in December 1861. That's a long way away politically. Yep. I mean, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in real life is issued on the 22nd of September 1862. But that's a very long period of time.
a lot of military action.
There is massive opposition to the Emancipation Proclamation within the North in real life, even when it is issued. I cannot conceive of circumstances in which Lincoln would have had the political strength, even if he had wanted, in January, February, March, April 1862, to issue something like an Emancipation Proclamation in the context of war with Britain. I mean, at the very least, if some kind of presidential proclamation on slavery had happened, it would have looked very different, would have happened at a different time, and would have been interpreted in different ways in the context of a war with Britain and France, as well as the Confederacy, and would likely to have been seen, as Chris has said before, as being merely an attempt to incite a slave rebellion, just as in fact the British did during the Revolutionary War.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, in fact, that was discussed in the North as being a possibility anyway. And so, it's interesting. I think what we're coming to, Adam, is the counterfactual is the whole character of the war would have been changed had the Trent Affair actually led to belligerency. My own view, I think it would have been limited. It would have been exemplary, and then everybody would have drawn back because I just don't think it's in Britain's interest to get involved.
Well, okay, let's go with me on this. If we're talking about this kind of negotiated settlement, and we're talking about, we're talking at the end of the war, how does then the entire country kind of come out of that?
There's one thing on that, Fergus, we haven't considered, and it's just occurred to me, is what if Britain and France had decided to enforce an armistice or peace on the two belligerents? That's an interesting case, because they could have said, look, we need the cotton, we need the grain.
So after the armistice, hold an interest in both sides?
And they actually enforce it. Then you've got a very interesting situation. You don't actually have to have troops on the ground. You just have to defend Canada. You actually control the coast, which you can do. You're in Mexico already, and we're saying to you, seconds out.
Yeah, I mean, once we're rolling down this route, you can imagine a post-armistice situation in which a newly independent Confederacy has even some sort of security guarantees from Britain and France in the way that Belgium did, with all the consequences.
Was it North and South Korea? Or China, after the Second World War. If Britain and France had thought it was in their interests to force an armistice here, they could have done it. There's no question about that. But it was never in their interest to do so. That was the point.
Does a divided North and South hold? And if so, for how long?
Do you mean, does it?
Do we ever then see the US come back together as one?
Well, Lincoln
This is where we have to.
Lincoln's second term.
So many different. I mean, I'm a little bit more bullish than I think Chris is about this alternative scenario we're doing here, right? So I can see how I think I can agree with you completely, Chris, that the intention in the scenario where the war had broken out in December '61 because the cable had still been in place. I totally agree with you that the British government's intention would have been to keep it limited. But I just don't know whether that would have been possible. I think I can imagine this sort of escalation, and once you get the invasion of Canada, and Britain have got to respond to it.
That's the turning point. If you invade Canada, you're in for the duration.
So I'm imagining here a scenario where Britain has been dragged into a war, which happened multiple times, through the 19th century. Britain, get dragged in by, as it were, the men on the spot, by circumstances beyond Whitehall's control, into a war they didn't really ever want to fight, that wasn't in their interest, that was damaging the interests of the City of London, but nevertheless they were fighting it. They have an incentive then to bring the fighting to a close as fast as possible, which is why you then get a brokering of negotiations. Your question is, could that have held?
Yeah.
I think so. Potentially, yes. I mean, not in a stable way, right? So, I mean, I don't think it would have been stable, but could you imagine a alternative timeline in which there's at least two, if not subsequently more, states, nation states within North America, in addition to British North America? Yes, I can absolutely imagine that. There's nothing foreordained about the borders of the United States, the hemispheric borders of the United States as we see them today. But it wouldn't have been a stable situation. And the ongoing role of Britain in France in kind of policing and monitoring this situation would have been important. But so too would have been the politics in the North, where there would have been the Lincoln administration. Well, Lincoln would certainly not have won a second term in this scenario, right? His administration would have regarded as a total failure. But the other thing that I think we haven't given enough emphasis to is what happens. What about the 4.5 million enslaved people who have massive agency in all of this?
Well, also the border states as well. So you say, Adam, it would be unstable. Where it's going to be unstable is in these border states. And remember, there's a ragged edge here in terms of slave owning, Virginia, right up into where the Union is.
Yeah.
So that is going to be the casus belli that will keep it going, I suspect.
Yes.
My own view, actually, on this, Adam, is I think they would have done their gradual emancipation. Remember, only 6% of people in the South actually own slaves. Only 6%. So I think the key difference, though, is this is a massively industrializing part of the United States. This is an agricultural.
And this is what I was getting at earlier. Presumably in that scenario, Britain is really pushing them as well for a gradual emancipation.
Well, they actually come up with it,
I mean, they wouldn't. I mean, Britain certainly, if they'd have... There's no way this is going to cease to be, slavery is going to cease to be an issue for Britain. Yeah. So even on our alternative timeline, yes, they're going to be putting diplomatic pressure on the Confederacy. I'm not as confident as Chris, though, that they would. There was huge, millions and millions of pounds invested in human property in the South. I mean, the resistance. I mean, it's true that at the very, very end of the war, the Confederate Congress offered emancipation in theory to enslaved people who fought for the Confederacy, although that never happened. There were never enslaved people fighting for the Confederacy in uniform. But it's true that at the very end, as a kind of, Hail Mary pass, they attempted that. So, I mean, there would have been continual pressure, of course, but the resistance and the strength of the slaveholding interest in the South was enormous. And so it may well have taken another war of some kind, in our alternative timeline, some other kind of war, 10, 20, 30, 50 years later, to have brought slavery to an end.
And remember, France gets kicked out of Mexico in 1867.
But no, not in this timeline.
Yeah, not in this
timeline, because this nascent, unstable Confederacy with British and French support would certainly, I think, have had the strength to keep Maximilian in power in Mexico.
And that puts a lot of pressure going this way.
Yeah. And as always with History Undone, whenever we're talking about the United States, I mean, this is not a United States. Do we see kind of America emerge as this global power?
No.
No.
No, we don't. I mean, there's a Comanche Empire here in the Southwest. There have been movements for secession in California and Oregon in the past. I think in this scenario, you get the splitting off of some far western states as well.
And the Confederacy is going to move west too.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the point. If you've got this relationship with Mexico, that totally alters the axis, if you like, and momentum of the way the 19th century completes. The only issue I've got is you have got this vastly powerful industrial capacity here, and we're entering the era of industrial warfare. Now, unless Britain and France basically arm the Confederates, they're not going to be able to cope with what's coming down the track here.
No.
That's the point. Remember, this is covered in railroads as well.
And a much higher population.
Yeah.
So, yes, which is being under-deployed in real life. And so,
And just final question for me. Obviously, we know in reality, we talked about it earlier, Britain started to source a lot of its cotton from India, Egypt, etc. Is there a scenario where, after this negotiated peace where we've got to, after a while, Britain kind of loses interest in the south or not? And then thinks actually we're going to...
There's a lot of resource here if you want to exploit it. I mean, the French are thinking, why on earth did we sell all this in the Louisiana Purchase? At this point, there's a lot of resource down here. So it becomes a different sort of economy, I suspect. As Adam says, you've got a very slow drip against slavery. By the 1860s, though, the rest of the world's actually abandoning slavery. I am sure the British would have said a condition of us protecting you, providing you with guarantees is you abolish slavery. Without that, it's not happening. That's how I see it.
I see that as a deal breaker for the White South.
Yeah, I agree.
Absolutely fascinating. I think we are certainly saying then...
And it makes them vulnerable for the North coming back again. Sorry for that.
We are certainly saying then slavery is still abolished, but you have an incredibly disunited states. France is obviously kicked out of Mexico. How long would it hold? That's a question perhaps for another day. I'm afraid that is all we've got time for today. My thanks to Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry and Professor Adam Smith for joining me, and we will be back on Doing More History very soon. Remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube, and you can also listen and follow the show as a podcast. Just search for History Undone in your podcast apps, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.